All right, welcome everyone. My name is Sonia Lara from the San Diego County Office of Education. This is day 3 or part 3 of our social injustice series, Restorative Justice for Students. So I'm your co-host for today. And then Ms. Yan, do you want to introduce yourself? My amazing co-host.
Sure, I am here. My name is Michelle Dr. Thompson. I work in Ed Tech at the county office, and I am excited to be here today with our incredible presenters, and I'll be working the chat room, Q&A.
Yeah, so any questions come in, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we can answer them after each speaker presents. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to one of my most awesome colleagues and friend, Captain Shanley, who's going to moderate this session for you. I know, right? Can you believe I'm saying that? I'm such in a good mood. You're on, friend. I'm going to mute myself.
Why, thank you, Sonia. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. My name is Jason Shanley. I'm a captain. I'm a 20-year veteran, Walmart security guard. And I just want you to know, we expect a mask when you enter, and you better show your receipt when you leave. Other than that, we hope that you enjoy your time at Walmart, and make sure you buy extra water. I'm kidding. So I'm Jason. I'm a fire captain with San Diego City Fire Department. I am the recruitment officer. I've been in the fire department 20 plus years. And I am excited to do anything that Sonia is doing, anything that San Diego County Office of Education is doing. They're wonderful partners in my recruitment efforts. And I'm very, very grateful to have been asked to be a part of this discussion today, not just because of Sonia and the team at SDCOE, but also because of the two people that I have the opportunity to hear today. Two people that are incredibly special in my life for various reasons. But one of them is for the topic that we're going to talk about today, for both of their commitments to the issues of social justice and the need for reparations in communities where trauma and hurt has taken place. And so I'm very excited to introduce, I'll introduce first my brother that I've known 15 plus years. His name is, I call him Wes, but his name is Wayne Burleson, but he goes by Wes. I met Wes about 16 years ago at Calipatria State Prison, and was an incredible meeting. And knowing him has changed my life. Somebody may ask, well, why is a firefighter in a social justice setting or whatever? And it's because of my passion. This profession has allowed me the opportunity to have a lot of doors open for me. One of the doors has been a passion of mine, which is ministering in the prison setting, and now ministering outside for reentry for formerly incarcerated women and men. And my relationship with Wes has been incredible. And so I will, in just a second, let him speak. But I also just wanted to mention someone who was equally as special to me, Ms. Genevieve Jones-Wright, who I affectionately call, from the bottom of my heart, my district attorney for life. She is my DA for life. I had the pleasure some years ago to help campaign with Ms. Jones-Wright on her run for district attorney. And I have the utmost amount of respect for what she does in the community all over the place. Her name is on everything. She's involved in everything that is justice related. And so I'm so excited to hear, and so excited for you all to be able to hear what she has. But before we hear from Ms. Jones-Wright, I'm going to turn it over and ask Wes if he would unmute and tell a little bit about his journey to where we are today. And I hope that you all enjoy this. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And you guys can hear me okay? I'm just checking. Okay. As Jason said, my name is Wayne Burleson, but I go by Wes. Him and I met a long time ago when I was in a different situation under very different circumstances. I think my story really begins at 3 when I found my grandmother dead, and from there experienced many things that happened to me in my life that I didn't understand as a kid. And eventually it led to me making decisions that I regret, that I can never take back, I can't fix, and I can't ever change. But for me to be here today is a miracle, just to be able to do this and to talk to you. And I'm going to share with you just a little bit about why that's a miracle for me. In 1997, I murdered somebody for money. Something that has caused me shame for 23 years. And it got my attention. It helped me to understand the value of life and to realize after I got incarcerated how valuable somebody's life was, including my own, which I didn't care about prior to that point. And I ended up having a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. And I had faced the consequences of what I had done by owning up to my actions. I tried to plead guilty in court. I said, I can't change what I've done, but I can make the right decisions from here on out. And I tried to say, hey, this is what I did. Whatever the law says I deserve, I deserve. And at the time it was a death penalty case. And instead they chose to drop the death penalty and give me life without. And for a long time, I didn't understand why it would have been better for me to live my life in prison until the day that I died, rather than die and go home to a better place in heaven. It makes sense now doing this, being able to talk to you today, being able to experience what I'm experiencing now. But for 23 years, I was incarcerated in some of the worst prisons in California. For 13 of those years, I was on maximum security level 4 institutions as a life without the possibility of parole, someone who is never going to go to the board, someone who is never going to get a chance to get out or see less violent prisons. And then things began to change. I think people's hearts began to change and their perspectives began to shift concerning criminal justice. And they changed the point system and allowed me to go to a lower level, which I thought was not possible for me because I believed that I was going to live and die in the worst prisons in California. And I got to go to a lower level. And in the midst of that, I had influential people in my life, like Jason, began to talk to me about trying to reach for something better for my future, because I was content with staying for the rest of my life because I believed that's what I owed to my victim and his family. And it just didn't seem right for me to be able to try to say, hey, I deserve a second chance, because I didn't believe that I did. I just tried to live the best that I could where I was. And I ended up filing for a commutation. Governor Brown granted it in August of 2018. Genevieve helped with that. She ended up looking at my commutation application and the packet that I sent and gave me advice and was a supporter and wrote me letters. And to my great surprise and my, I guess, shock, the governor changed my sentence from life without to 25 years to life. And it was about a year after that that I got to go to the parole board, and I got found suitable the very first time. And I got released on September 8th, 2020. I guess my message is this. It didn't begin with the choice that I made to do what I did the day that I took my victim's life. It began with small choices that I made a long time prior to that, when I said that I would never smoke or drink or do drugs or do any of the things that I saw other people do that destroyed their lives. And when I crossed the first boundary, it wasn't that much further to get to the next. And so when I started smoking at 15 years old, it was only one step away to begin drinking. And once I crossed that line, I said, I'll never do drugs or snort cocaine or do any of those things. But it was only one step further for me to take to begin to smoke marijuana. And eventually I was one step away from murder. And so the seemingly insignificant choices that I was making all along the way as I was a kid trying to deal with the things that I experienced in life, I discovered after I ended up doing something that was the worst of the worst, that they were never insignificant. And so if I could share with you, if you're maybe a youth watching today, or even somebody who's an adult and living your life, my hope and my desire is that maybe you would hear from my story something that encourages you to understand that the choice that you're thinking about making to do something that you are risking regretting in the future, that maybe you would look at it from a different perspective and understand that it's not insignificant, that it matters. And hopefully maybe the words that I share or Genevieve shares or anybody else that you've heard during this conference or today after we speak, that maybe something will resonate with you. And that's my story. It's a privilege to talk to you. I shouldn't be here, but I am many times over, and I can really only attribute it to the grace of God and the kindness of other people in my life. Thank you.
Wow. Um, I've heard that story over and over again. And every time I hear it, it's like the first time. Super impactful. There's a lot of things that are in between that story as well that will be brought out today. And it goes right along with the subject of restorative justice that we're talking about today. And how do you restore wrongs that seem unrestorable? And so with that, I want to pass it over to one of my favorite people, the attorney of all attorneys, a giant amongst giants, the one and only local legend, a hero of Southeast San Diego. I mean, I don't even know what else to say. One of the most powerful and effective African-American women that I've ever had the chance to meet and know personally. And so I just want to welcome you, Miss Genevieve Jones-Wright, to take it from here, and welcome.
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Jason Shanley. Wes, thank you so much for sharing from your heart, which you really do have a great ability to do when it comes to just your writings and letters, most definitely your art. And I want to talk to you about that. So we're here today to talk about restorative justice and what that looks like, and the goals and the aims of restorative justice. So before I actually get into my presentation, I wanted to talk with you, Wes, just a little bit more and kind of flesh out some of the details, and so that we can actually explore how restorative justice played a part in your rehabilitation and your acknowledgement of the actions that you took and how that impacted folks. So, Wes, did you have a chance to engage in restorative circles or to participate in any restorative justice oriented programs while you were at Calipatria or elsewhere?
To be honest, Genevieve, many of the restorative justice groups that we had, they didn't exist in the prison system early on. And they definitely didn't exist on the high security institutions that I was at. My restorative justice approach came primarily from church at that time. But when we got to go to lower levels and the landscape began to change, we began to create victims awareness groups that were restorative justice based, or were based on restorative justice approach. And so I got to be a part of victim awareness classes that were based on a restorative justice rather than a retributive justice model. And from there, there were many other opportunities that we began to create, and then eventually got sponsored by the state.
When you talked about victim awareness programs or classes, what did that look like and what was the focus?
Um, well, the one that I started with was done through a group called Peer Health, when I was a peer health educator. And it was just a 7-session victim awareness class that helped to introduce individuals to being able to understand what empathy is for the people that we harmed. And it started with a 911 audio recording of a woman that was on the phone with the police, and she had her baby in her arms, and she was hiding in the closet because someone was breaking into her home. And as she's begging the police, begging the 911 operator to help, that the man was getting closer and closer and closer. And she's crying and she's talking about her child in her arms and screaming, "Please help, he's coming." The next thing that you hear are gunshots. And the audio ends there. And we began with that because it helped individuals with hardened hearts that are able to do things to other people that shouldn't be done, to put themselves in that woman's shoes and to understand the harm that we do when we commit crimes and when we harm other people. So and it opened men's hearts in a great way. And then we began to do like mock scenes and playing out scenarios of what it would mean to be the victim of a crime, to hopefully raise awareness in guys' hearts and their minds to understand what it would be like to be on the receiving end of the things that we did to people. And then from there begin to ask questions. What can we do for our victims? Not just for our debt to society, but what about the people that we've hurt? How can we do something about that?
Wes, when you first got sentenced and you went to state prison, did you have a thought that maybe someone else was to blame for your actions? Were you pointing the fingers at other people and had a challenge in accepting responsibility for yourself and for your actions that caused you to be there?
For me, it was pretty quickly that I got the picture, that I understood that I did this to myself, that the consequences that I was facing were because of the choices that I made. And I started having to grapple with the big issues, the ideas about God, the ideas about forgiveness. I began to think about myself at 35, 40 years old, which I had never thought of before. I was a 20-year-old kid. And for the first time, I saw my life being that long. Then I thought about myself being 70 years old and in prison. And then I realized what I had taken from my victim, the amount of life that he still had ahead of him. And I wanted forgiveness, but I couldn't get it from him because I had taken his life. And so I began to seek it from God. And the next thing that happened is I began to question, what do I do about my case? Everything in the judicial system says lie about it, don't tell anyone anything. And I remember that there was a scripture that came to my mind that said, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. And I wasn't trying to get free from my consequences. I was trying to be free from the person that I had become. I said, I have to trust God enough to be willing to be honest. And from there started a journey where I continued to try to plead guilty. But my attorney wouldn't acquiesce. He wouldn't agree with me. So I was forced to go to trial. And I took the stand in my own trial. And I admitted to everything that I did. And I got to say to my victim's family that I regret what I had done. And I know that I could never change it or take it back. But I can make the right decisions going forward. And that doing what I did in court was the right thing to do. And that was where my journey of restorative justice began.
So Wes, I'm assuming you were in open court when you were addressing the family members of your victim. Did anyone in the system afford you the opportunity to actually sit down with them and talk with them about the crime that you committed and how it affected them?
To sit down with my victim's family?
Yes.
No. If anything, even in sentencing, which broke my heart because I knew that I had an obligation to them. I had done something to them that was terrible, that I had suffered in my own life, and I understood how grave that was. But even in my sentencing, the judge would not allow me to look at them. He couldn't stop me from speaking, but he wouldn't allow me to address them and look at them. And so I wasn't afforded that opportunity. Even right now, while I'm on parole, I'm prohibited from being able to try to contact my victim's family. And that's a part of my parole conditions.
And that's something that I definitely want to address in the presentation when we talk about a restorative criminal justice system versus a punitive one. And I think that a lot of the things that happen in our traditional criminal legal system really cuts against showing humanity, not just to the person who did the harm, but the people who were affected by the offense. And that is something that restorative justice advocates recognize, that when we do restorative practices and when we incorporate them into our criminal legal system, we actually benefit everyone. The way that we're doing it now is very hurtful and it serves no purpose. It actually widens this gap. It widens the separation between the person who caused the harm and the people who were harmed by the offense. And I see that very strongly with what you just said. I think it was a failure by every person in the system, from the judge to the prosecutor all the way down through the system where you were not given that opportunity to relate as a human to other human beings that were affected by your conduct. But Wes, you did make amends in your own way. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So I had agreed with my probation officer who did the probation officer's report before sentencing that I would be willing to pay for the burial costs of my victim. And I didn't know how I would do that at the time, but I knew that it was my responsibility. And when I got sentenced, I had a restitution fine, a victim's witness restitution fine of almost $10,000, $9,977 for his burial costs. And most individuals have some form of restitution fine, but in prison they often don't pay it because your wages are 7 cents an hour, 13 cents an hour, 35 cents an hour at best. And so it would have taken me 45 years when I did the math if I had the highest paying prison job and I always worked to be able to pay off that restitution, which I owed to his family. And instead I found a different avenue. I utilized my art as an instrument to be able to make money through the hobby program in prison and sell my artwork. And I was able to pay off that debt, that responsibility in 18 years. It took me 18 years, but I was able to do it, and I did it while I was still in LWAP. And then I created the Prison Artist Guild, which is a class inside that was the intent was to teach other guys how to do the same thing. Because not only do you owe it to your victim or your victims, you owe it to yourself, because if you get out, you're automatically going to be in debt if you're continuing to avoid that obligation. And so I was able to do that. And I'm still doing artwork. This is behind me is a mural that I'm painting currently as my first mural job since I've been out.
So Wes, I think that you're an extraordinary person, as evinced by you being able to have your sentence commuted because of your stellar conduct while you were there in state prison, which a lot of people fall into the traps of being incarcerated, but you were able to stay focused. You were able to keep your faith. And because of the restoration that you sought and got through your faith, you were able to, in your own ways, make amends and try to reconcile with the persons who did harm to you. You also did something for me that was incredible. And I want to just show everyone at home why it is so important for us to remember that when someone goes to prison, or even when they're booked into county jail, they don't lose their humanity. And that's what restorative justice really focuses on. It is the humanity of even the person who did the harm. And so if everyone can see, this is obviously the title of the presentation, What is Restorative Justice? But going to the next slide, this is a picture that was used in my campaign when I ran for San Diego County District Attorney. And behind me on the building, it says social justice. This was actually a picture that was taken while I was on location at Lincoln High School, one of our schools right here in the San Diego Unified School District. And I picked this location for a variety of reasons. And this is a picture that I say was shared all across this nation, and it was amazing to see it. But Wes, you took this picture and you actually created a work of art, and you were using your talents to actually bring light to the very issue of criminal justice reform. And so I want to just share this with the people who are here with us today. Wes, can you just talk about how you created this, where you created this, and why you created this? Because I didn't commission this portrait.
Yeah, for me, it was because of the willingness that you had, even other individuals, but the willingness that you had to help me in my darkest times. And I believe that it was a representation of everything that went along with that. It was it's very difficult to find people that are willing to get on your side and to get behind the good things that you're doing when your past is so much different than who you are currently. And the fact that you were willing to do that, and that was also the entirety of what you were doing, I felt that I had an obligation to let you know how much I appreciated what you do in general and what you did to help me, because it played out in a very, very practical way in my life. And I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Well, Wes, I'm very grateful to you, not just for this work of art, if I may say so myself, but just grateful for you coming here and being transparent and being very vulnerable. And I just want to say, you captured every single element of that photo, down to my wedding ring, down to the curls in my hair. And it really just speaks to the genius inside of you that we could have been deprived of at a high level had you had to remain in prison, had that sentence stayed the way that it was intended to stay. And so that brings me to this very topic of restorative justice. And so restorative justice is the idea that crime hurts and that justice should heal. And I put should in italicized font because our criminal justice system, as it now stands, does not seek to heal the folks who are ushered into our criminal legal system. And you'll hear me say criminal legal system more than I say criminal justice system, because I think that there's a lot of work that we need to do to actually put in place the justice that we need in our criminal legal system. But restorative justice acknowledges that crime hurts, but that also that justice should heal. So it offers an alternative to our current punitive system. Wes, you talked about retribution and our retributive system that we are under. We have a very punitive system. And what restorative justice allows for is for a system of criminal justice that focuses on the rehabilitation of the persons who did the harm through reconciliation with victims and the community at large. This will be the last time you all will see victims in my presentation, because I believe that words matter. And so I don't use the terms offender, I use the terms persons who did the harm. And for victims, I really like to say survivors of crime. I think when we use language like offenders and victims, we really pigeonhole people to a circumstance, to a condition that is very temporal. And even if we're still working through our traumas on both ends, being the person who survived the harm and who was impacted by the harm, or being the person who did the harm itself, we are all still going through trauma and processing. And even though that may be a process, at some point, we hope to move forward. And so I don't like using language that keeps us in that moment that will define us as a perpetrator or a criminal or an offender or even a victim. And so I want to also make sure that that is really clear in this presentation. And I think that that is very restorative in the approach. So words matter, language matter, and words are very powerful. And Wes, at any point, if you want to chime in and say anything, please feel free to do that. This is by all means our presentation. So going to the next slide, and that first idea that restorative justice is an idea that crime hurts and justice should heal. It acknowledges that crime is more than just breaking the law. Wes, as you talked about, your actions on that day didn't just impact the person whose life you took. It impacted their family members. It impacted their communities. It impacted whole neighborhoods and churches, whatever type of relationships that person had. And so restorative justice really acknowledges that it's not just breaking the law. An offense is not just breaking the law. It causes harm to people, to relationships, and community. I was a public defender for 13 years, and I can tell you that sometimes my clients came to me after doing a hurtful act to another family member. So it didn't just cause harm to the people themselves who suffered the loss or suffered the violence, it caused harm to their relationships. Things were never the same as a result of the harmful conduct. And so restorative justice recognizes this. It recognizes this very thing. And it also recognizes that because crime causes harm to people, relationships, and community, that the harm must be addressed and the wrongdoing must be addressed. And so restorative practices, which is not synonymous to restorative justice, I'll talk about that in a bit, but restorative practices, which is the category that restorative justice is a subset of, people argue, leads to an actual addressing of the root cause of the wrongdoing. And that is so very important. When you start to engage in restorative practices, you will get to the root of what caused the wrongdoing. So at this point, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen to give an example of that. And I've seen this play out in a lot of different ways. So there was an incident that happened at a school right here in San Diego where there was a person who was a student who did another harm to a special needs student, who everyone loved this special needs student. This person was well beloved on the campus, and everyone took offense to the harm that was done to this student. It was something that was done in a bullying fashion. It was done through social media. And so this was a harm that reverberated throughout the entire school campus. Well, the conduct of this student violated the conduct policy of the school. And so the first thing that the school wanted to do was to suspend that student. This was actually during my race for district attorney. And I was a very big proponent, still am, of restorative justices and restorative practices. And so a person at the school reached out to me and said, I don't really believe that restorative justice works, but you talk about it all the time. And so I want to know if we can actually implement restorative practices and engage in restorative justice with this student so that this student doesn't have to be suspended from school. Can you help us with that? And that was said to the teacher's credit. And so they engaged in restorative practices with the student. And what they learned was that that bullying behavior was a symptom of what was happening in that student's home that no one was aware of, so it was never addressed. And so what ended up happening was that this student was able to talk in a safe setting with community members who were there to support them, along with the person who suffered the harm, along with school officials, and get that student the services that they need, and also to address the conduct. That is the power of restorative justice and the power of restorative practices being in place in our schools and education. The one thing that we know to be 100% clear is that when we separate children from their education, when we suspend them, when we expel them, it really doesn't serve any benefits to that person's educational career. To have that disciplinary record will impact them in the future. And it shouldn't be our go-to. Certainly there are things that require different types of punishment, but it has been the go-to. And so that is one of the focuses of restorative justice, is to serve as an alternative to the things that we go to first as a tool. And it really does challenge us to dig deep into our toolkits and not do what's easy, because the easy thing is to say you're expelled because you violated a conduct policy. But it is harder to commit to time with the person harmed, with the community, and work with that person to get to the root causes of their wrongdoing. And so I was very happy to see that happen right here with our school district. And I really want to see this happen more than in just kind of these one-off situations. So restorative justice offers an alternative to our current punitive system. Our current system of criminal justice is based on the punishment of offenders rather than rehabilitation. We have a system that looks to punishment being the end goal primarily versus rehabilitating. So we have now gone back to this Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations, and not just CDC, the Department of Corrections, but we've really got to emphasize rehabilitation. And unfortunately, right now, although we're saying that we're focusing on rehabilitation, we are centered on re-entry efforts rather than other things that would really help with rehabilitation before the 6 months before you're due to come back to community. And so now we're engaging in the work of re-entry. So I say that to say we have a lot of work to do. Restorative justice, and if you want to sound like you're an expert in the know, you call it RJ. And RJ is an approach to justice that involves all affected parties with the goal of repairing the harm caused. And it also offers an alternative to the juvenile justice system. And I put this point here because the juvenile justice system itself has a goal of rehabilitation. It has a goal of helping our youth reintegrate into the community, but it is still punitive. Our juvenile justice system, until our governor said, I want to remove the Department of Juvenile Justice from the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, it was still very punitive in nature. And so when we talk about it, even offering an alternative to the juvenile justice system, that is a reality. Restorative justice is a system of criminal justice that focuses on the rehabilitation of the persons who did the harm through reconciliation with the harmed persons and the community at large. So one thing that it does is it humanizes the person who did the harm. When Wes was speaking, it really hit me that our system continues to fail, not just the person who has been labeled the defendant, but it also fails families and the people who were directly impacted and harmed by the conduct. What did Wes tell us? In court, he was told not to look at the family members of the person whose life he took. He was told not to speak to them. Well, that serves no purpose. I can tell you that as a public defender, that is something that is said throughout the process. Don't look at them. Don't say anything to them. They may take that as you staring them down or trying to intimidate them. I can speak to the other side of this. When the people who have been labeled defendants and who engage in harmful conduct don't look at the people who were harmed by their conduct, that can actually be taken as not taking responsibility, not owning up to your actions, and as callous behavior. It really doesn't humanize. It actually dehumanizes people in the process because you're telling that person to just sit up, look straight ahead, don't have any emotions. Where's the humanity in that? Wes wanted to look at the family. Wes wanted to address the family. Wes wanted to show emotion. And our system actually dehumanizes everyone in the process. And so restorative justice humanizes the person who did the harm as well as the community members and the other harmed people. Restorative justice is also the rehabilitative aspect that seeks to protect the community and the person's harmed. If you look at it, some people say, well, restorative justice just sounds like a slap on the wrist. No, restorative justice is doing the hard work. Restorative justice means that you are taking measures, corrective measures, to avoid that person engaging in offenses again. Restorative justice seeks to address the root cause of the wrongdoing so that it doesn't happen again, and so the community is then protected. Restorative justice also places great weight on the rights of the persons harmed, so much that they seek to remedy what actually happened that brought the person to bring the harm. Like Wes said, he was hurt and traumatized. He was already broken at age 7 when he found his grandmother deceased. This is the reality of our justice system. The people who show up, especially as adults in our criminal legal system, usually, and especially in my experience as a public defender, I would see that these adults didn't just show up in adult court. They usually showed up having a juvenile dependency record or juvenile delinquency record. At some point, the system had already failed them. These are people who have experienced their own traumas, and especially when we're talking about communities of color that are over-policed, communities of color whose children are ushered into the criminal justice system at a young age, so much that we have a term called the school to prison pipeline. And I say it's the preschool to prison pipeline because those numbers bear out that our children of color as preschooler, and especially Black preschoolers, are expelled from preschool at disproportionately higher rates, overwhelmingly than their white counterparts. And so with restorative justice, there's this understanding that there has to be a trauma-informed lens, that it is not about what is wrong with that child or what is wrong with that person. What was wrong with Wayne Burleson? The question becomes, what happened to that child? What happened to that adult? What happened to Wayne Burleson? And that's the focus of restorative justice. And so restorative justice also promotes society's right to safety. We all have a right to be safe in our homes. We all have a right to be safe walking down the street. We all have a right to be safe as we worship in our synagogues, in our temples, in our mosques, in our church. So with restorative justice, it promotes society's rights to safety by actually getting down to the heart of why someone caused a harm in the first place so that it is not repeated. What does restorative justice seek to achieve? Well, I keep talking about it. It seeks to repair the harm. And I can tell you that our punitive justice system does not seek to repair the harm. Again, the end goal is normally punishment. How can I give you a life sentence without the possibility of parole so you can sit and think about what you did so that I can punish you? This is how we got to our very carceral state as a state and as a nation. So restorative justice says, I want to repair the harm. I don't want to seek punitive measures as my end goal. Yes, punishment can be a part of restorative justice, and it is. And it is. Going to point number 2, restorative justice seeks to achieve encounters between the parties to determine the best way to do repair that the harm has done, to do repair to the harm that was done. This is important because restorative justice isn't a one-time meeting. Restorative justice is work. It is encounters where the persons who were harmed have the chance and the opportunity to confront the persons who have done the harm to them and show how that hurt has hurt them. This is not something that our current system affords for people who are harmed. At most, a survivor of a crime will be able to read a letter or to address the court at sentencing. Well, by that time, it's a little too late. Our system does not empower survivors of crime, whereas restorative justice puts survivors of crime right there at the center where they're able to directly speak to the person who has done the harm to them and really show how that harm has impacted them, their spouse, their children, their neighbors, their other family members. And this is why I talk about restorative justice as something that is transformative, because through these various encounters and doing the work, sometimes one of the things that is a determination about what needs to be done is a punishment. And the survivor of the crime is a part of that decision making about what that should look like. Restorative justice also seeks to transform people, communities, and relationships. And it seeks to reintegrate the person who did the harm back into the community. That is so powerful because there's a redemptive factor here. There is this focus on redemption. When we look at the word restorative, we see the word restore. How do we restore people back into the community? Restorative justice recognizes that no one should be thrown away, that there is value in every single person. Going back to Wes, restoring Wes, seeing his value as a human is so critical, and it's vital. It's vital that we do that for every other Wes out there in the world, to bring them back into the community and say, yes, you made bad decisions. However, we welcome you back into our community. We're going to help you. We're going to support you. We're going to support you all the way through this. Whatever you need, we got you, because we don't want you going back to what led you to be there in the first place. And so repair, having encounters that are transformative, and reintegration. What does restorative justice actually do? So again, it personalizes the crime. I want to make sure that this is really clear, because when we talk about our criminal legal system, one of the things that really annoys me, I'll say it annoys me, is that the prosecution comes into the courtroom, and even before they come into the courtroom, they're filing charges in our name. It's in the name of the people of the state of California. So it's the people of the state of California versus this individual who allegedly did a harm. There's really no personalization to the crime or of the offense that was done. It doesn't center the survivor. It actually takes away this personalizing of the offense and the harm that was done, because it actually says that the state is the victim, right? What does that do? It puts the power of other people to then decide what should happen. And that's the model of our criminal legal system. And I really can't overstate the need to really empower survivors of crime to actually be a voice. And restorative justice does that. So survivors of crime are very centered. They play an active role. That is not what we see in our traditional criminal legal system. And while the survivors of the crime are centered, the people who did the harm take meaningful responsibility for their actions. We have to understand that restorative justice cannot happen unless we have the buy-in from the person who did the harm, as well as the person who was affected by the harm. If one party doesn't want to engage, then there's no engagement. There are some ways for the person who suffered the harm or the violence, or who was harmed by the offense, to actually say, I don't want to participate. However, I will not stand in the way of this person being a part of a restorative circle or having the benefit of restorative justice. And so we see that. It helps responsible parties avoid future offenses. The numbers bear that out. And it also considers crimes as offenses against a person versus the state, which is what I talked about with the personalization of the crime. And I really do think that's important. And I think that we have to talk about that more. It's not a crime against the state, this government that says, I'm the government, I'm here to promote public safety. Yes, that's one part of it. But restorative justice also recognizes that there was a person who did the harm. And when that person is put in front of the person who caused the harm, we actually see more transformation, more of an awareness. It's when that person is actually confronted with the very personal stories about how their conduct affected other people that we actually see the change. And that's the beauty of restorative justice. And so some of the benefits of restorative justice is that studies have shown us that it substantially reduces repeat offending for many offenders. And my critique on how we implement restorative justice and practices here and in a lot of places across our country is that for the more violent and serious offenses, they say, and by they, I mean the people and the powers that be say, well, that person doesn't deserve restorative justice. That person just needs to be punished. When the numbers and the studies bear out the fact that restorative justice actually is even more transformative for the more serious crimes. Just look at West, right? We think of murder as the top level crime. This is so unforgivable. It's right up there with rape. But restorative justice doesn't have a limit. This idea of restoration doesn't have a limit. And so it actually helps people never offend again. It reduces repeat offending more than prison, actually, for adults, and also for youth that are placed into prison. It doubles, if not even more, the offenses brought to justice as diversions from criminal justice. And so when we talk about restorative justice, I'm a very big proponent that people shouldn't have to plead guilty in order to get into diversion programs. That if these people show that they want to engage in the work, that we should allow for them to avoid ever going into our criminal justice system, especially our children. And when restorative justice is used as diversion, it helps to reduce the cost of criminal justice. And we're seeing the benefits of that in California. It provides both the persons who did the harm and the harmed persons with more satisfaction that justice has been done than did the traditional criminal justice system. So I talked about that a little earlier. These are some of the benefits of restorative justice. It also reduces post-traumatic stress symptoms and related costs. And it reduces the desire for violent revenge against the people who offended them, allowing for survivors of crime to be there to address the persons who did them harm really is powerful. And so it does curb that desire to somehow seek revenge because the traditional criminal legal system kept them from doing that. So you can see there where I have the site. I would encourage you all to go. I'm going to also give you a resource list at the end of this presentation. But is there room for restorative justice and restorative practices in our schools? Absolutely. So San Diego Unified School District, for example, declared themselves to be a restorative district. And that is wonderful. I can tell you that we need restorative practices all throughout the district. We need restorative justice all throughout the district. And let me tell you why. Let me go to this first. Here's some words of wisdom and lessons learned. Educators have come to realize that you can't punish a child into doing anything. Think about how our mass incarceration machine has curbed crime. It hasn't. It hasn't. Because it doesn't get to the heart of why a person actually committed the crime in the first place. And it is the same with children. The same way that we can't incarcerate our way out of crime, we have to take a different approach. It is the same with our children. Punishing a child is not going to make them do what you want them to do. We have to get to root causes. We have to really show our hearts with our children. We have to be amenable to showing restoration and being redemptive. And it takes patience. Again, it's the easy button. Expulsions and suspensions are easy buttons. But let me talk to you about something else that is an easy button. Look at this quote. When a school allows a school resource officer to arrest a student or refers a student to law enforcement or juvenile court as a form of discipline, that student is being turned over to the juvenile justice system by the school. Just let that resonate. The fact that we have police officers on our campus. We may call them school resource officers, but they are law enforcement, and they have been given the authority to arrest students or to refer students to other law enforcement agencies or to usher them into the juvenile justice system. And what we've seen is that this is the first contact that many of our students have with the criminal justice system, and it leads to more. So as I talked about the preschool to prison pipeline, this first contact makes it that much easier to get a juvenile record, so that if that child gets into trouble again, then it offers an incentive for an even harsher punishment a little later. The bigger picture is that schools have resourced taking care of things that should be school-related punishments and disciplines, and have created a system to where we are literally handing our children over to the juvenile justice system. We see great disparities as it relates to Black girls who suffer a disproportionate rate of expulsion and suspension, and also arrest for school-related disciplinary actions. We see disproportionate levels and rates of Indigenous students. We see disproportionate rates of Black students, both boys and girls, where they make up a very small part of the population in the school, but the biggest population that is suspended. And so restorative justice helps us with our approach, and it really moves us away from being punitive and hitting that easy button as well with our schools. And so, yes, there's room for restorative justice and restorative practices. And I want to make sure that I say this. Restorative justice is more of a sort of a reactive type of system where an offense or wrongdoing has already occurred, whereas restorative practices is more proactive. These are the tools that we need to actually build entire communities and to promote healthy relationships and to empower everyone and to prevent wrongdoing. Yes, there can be restorative practices, of course, once a wrongdoing has been done, but restorative practices really is a way for us to empower communities and to prevent wrongdoings from happening, which is why I'm a very big proponent of not just restorative justice, but restorative practices in our schools. And it really does make a difference. So as promised, I'm going to give you some resources. The Center for Justice and Reconciliation. No, that is not a typo. Center is spelled with an R-E and not an E-R for this particular organization, because restorative justice is happening all around the world. And so this particular resource here is one that comes from a different country. And we have to understand that restorative justice really dates back centuries when we talk about Indigenous people, and that is how their communities thrive. There was not a throwing away of community members who did a harm. It was this notion that we have to be restorative in our approach and restore folks back to our communities. San Diego Unified School District here listed, that is a great resource on their restorative justice practices. Also, Education Week is a great resource. So I don't know if you all can take a screenshot here, but that would be great. You could take a screenshot right here on your screen. I can make this available as well after. But this particular article, and there are a few, was actually a blog, ways to implement restorative practices in the classroom. And the US Department of Education provides us snapshots. This particular link that I placed here on this slide actually shows a snapshot of the disproportionate impact of suspension and expulsions on some of those groups that I talked about. So our Black students, Black preschoolers, Native students, Latino students. So that's also a great resource. I want to thank you all so much. I'm sure that there are probably some questions. I would love to take them and answer them if I can. Hopefully that was helpful.
Wow.
Thank you, Genevieve. We do have some questions. And I also want to note that unfortunately, we got some emails from educators that the students were having difficulty getting in. So they came in a little late. So some questions you might have answered already. So sorry if you have to repeat yourself. But let's take a few minutes to answer the several that came in. And then to everyone who joined us late, we will make sure to get the recording out to you all for you to watch the beginning piece that you might have missed. So here we go. So can this be connected? And I'm not sure if this pertains to a particular slide, but can this be connected to the school to prison pipeline, restorative justice?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is directly connected to the school to prison pipeline. The fact that we are so punitive in our approach in pretty much all the systems here in this country, especially when we're talking about the education system and the criminal legal system. When we have this very punitive focus, we're going to have punitive results. And so when we talk about how our youth are ushered into the criminal justice system, it really does start with that referral to law enforcement by a school resource officer or that arrest for a school-related disciplinary action. But it also starts with just simply expelling or suspending a child. It is very clear that, now we're under COVID and everything's virtual, but when you take students out of the classroom, as would happen with, normal suspensions and expulsions on a regular day and not our new normal that I hope isn't the new normal for a very long time, but you would be taking them out of spaces where they are learning and connecting, and you're placing them into an environment where maybe their parents are not home to watch over them because their parents are at work. So the students are now not in school and they're probably not in the safety of their own home. They're roaming around, they're doing God knows what with their friends, and then they get into some other trouble. The other part of this is not all of our kids get into trouble, but we know that some communities of color are over policed. Many of our communities of color are over policed. So then you have a child who is thought to be truant, which we've seen happen right here in San Diego, is then also ushered into the criminal justice system because that person is now taken in. And so there's a variety of ways that we see this intersection between the criminal justice system, the school to prison pipeline, and restorative justice. Whereas if we never took a punitive approach, if we never expelled that child, if we never suspended that child, if we never had a school resource officer on our campus, if we never sent them to law enforcement versus just having that student come into the principal's office to deal with the behavior or conduct, it is a direct correlation. And so with restorative justice, again, I can't overstate this enough. The idea is that we have to really challenge ourselves and not do what's easy and not say that's a violation of this rule or a violation of this policy, and say, how do we get to the heart of the matter? And again, the question is not what is wrong with you, it is what happened to you. And that's what restorative justice asks. And so those are the things that we have to be mindful of even on school campus, because kids are coming to us broken. Kids have seen a lot. Kids have their own traumas, whether it happened on the school playground or in the classroom or in their home or elsewhere. And so we have to be mindful of that. And so I really can't emphasize that there is a direct bridge between being punitive and then having this thing that is a very real thing called the preschool to prison pipeline. Because even in that term, we acknowledge that from the time our children are in school, they are being prepared to end up in prison, from preschool to elementary to juvenile hall to county jails to state prison. And that's the reality of it.
Thanks for answering that. I'm actually going to hand this over to Jason. He texted me to remind me that he's the moderator. So I'm gonna mute myself.
He did.
Jason will take over. There's 4 more questions.
Thank you so much, Sonia. We appreciate that, Ms. Lyra. So next question, good question. We'll ask this 2 ways. The question is stated, would mental help be part of restorative justice? I'm just going to ask it the way it was typed. Would mental help, HELP, be part of restorative justice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, restorative justice really does recognize that people have been hurt and that none of us are coming into any spaces without having suffered any hurt or some sort of trauma. It starts there. And that's why restorative justice really does have a trauma informed lens. And so when we're asking about what happened to the person, it necessarily means that if there are mental health issues that have not been addressed, that we have to seek wraparound services to address even those mental health needs. And that's the very basic and bare minimum, that if there are mental health needs, we've got to be in a place where we are addressing them. That is absolutely a restorative practice. We've seen, due to our very carceral nature, that our jails are full of folks who have mental health issues and they're not getting the treatment that they need. What happens if we don't incarcerate people who are suffering from mental health issues and we actually leave them in the community, but in places where they can get help for their mental health issues? We would see a very drastic reduction in our jail suicides. We would see a very drastic reduction in abuse by the hands of law enforcement. We would see a drastic reduction in interactions between law enforcement and those who suffer mental health crises. I'll give you an example. Right now, what's happening in the community is this big conversation about how law enforcement should show up in our communities. And one of those big topics is that police officers should not be first responders. They should not be who we call to deal with the mental health crisis. We see that that leads to escalation of situations and at worst, the loss of life, because a family member called for help of a loved one for a loved one who was experiencing a mental break of some sort. And then their loved one ends up dead. And so that is a part of being restorative. And it is addressing those root causes, but also asking us to reevaluate how we've come to implement what we deem as law enforcement. And should we have law enforcement there when it comes to mental health issues?
Good stuff. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have three questions left. The one question is, how can we lower the racial disparities seen in incarceration rates and the court system? So how can we lower the racial disparities seen in incarceration rates and the court system?
So my humble opinion is we have to do an entire system overhaul. The only way that we can actually lower the racial disparities seen in our incarceration rates is to do a system overhaul. I talk about systemic racism all the time. This is something that we absolutely have to understand and acknowledge. California incarcerates the most Black people of any other state. This is who we are. Everyone says California is very progressive. We're not that progressive. And the fact that California incarcerates more Black people than any other state really speaks volumes, because look at Louisiana, look at Alabama, look at these southern states. And so systemic racism is a very real thing. When we understand the very roots of policing, when we understand that certain systems were designed with white supremacy in mind so that white supremacy could be upheld, and that our original police officers were there to actually recapture people who were enslaved, who ran away for their freedom, but to bring them back into captivity in order to keep a system going. We understand that there are certain policies and rules that are in place. And so when we see racial disparities in our criminal legal system, it is an offshoot of that. It is a symptom of the systems that we have in place that are very much rooted in racism? And so that's not a very easy question that I can answer, because really the answer is we have to dismantle it. We have a system that adultifies Black children, and there's data about this. We can go back to the Trayvon Martin story, that tragedy, right? Where we had George Zimmerman testify that he thought 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was a grown adult in his 20s. And that is the same lens that a lot of our educators, that a lot of our judges, that a lot of our prosecutors, that a lot of people have when they interface with Black boys and Black girls. There's so many studies about this. The numbers bear this out. And so when you adultify young children, you make them more culpable than, let's say, their white counterpart, because what is an innocent action of wrongdoing that you would expect a child to do, when it is done by a child of color, a Black child, a Latinx child, then it is seen as needing punishment, not some sort of a talking to or some other course for correcting that behavior. And so when we talk about how do we address these racial disparities and how do we reduce it, it really is going to take us acknowledging systemic racism and addressing those things at the root, and not doing things like adultifying certain students, not giving more of a benefit of the doubt to white criminal defendants. When we look at the death penalty, we know that when there is a white victim and a Black perpetrator, that Black perpetrator is more likely to get the death penalty. So we have a system that values the lives of white people more than Black people. When we look at the numbers that bear out for our children who are minors but are prosecuted as adults, before we changed that law in 2016, Black children were overwhelmingly ushered into the adult system as compared to their white counterparts. So were Latinx children. And so these are systemic things. And so the only way to curb the racial disparities is to really look at this, have truthful conversations about it, and then change the system itself, change the policies, and change the way that we look at each other.
Wow. Amazing. We got a couple more questions that have come in. Really good questions. I'm going to save two of them for the end. The next question is, how can we bring this to people's attention who don't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily agree, or they deny systemic racism? So how do we bring this to people's attention who don't necessarily agree or they deny systemic racism?
And there's a lot of people who would say, what do you mean slavery's been over for a very long time? But we have to understand that there have been lingering effects of racist institutions. And this comes from a place that, I have an entire organization that we are literally rooted in this acknowledgement that all of our systems are rooted in white supremacy, from our healthcare system to our education system, to our political system, to our legal system, any system that we have. And what I would say is this: we don't need for folks to buy into their own buying in, right? We're not asking that you actually be the person that bears the blame, but accepting that reality. There's way too many studies. There's way too much data out there. I would say let them watch a documentary called Push. Jason Shanley and I, with some other folks, actually brought that documentary. We had a viewing at the Educational Cultural Complex. And this really shows this idea, right? It's not an idea, it's the reality that Black girls are overly punished in our school systems. Things like that would help people understand that we're not just talking, that these are things that are reality and that need to be addressed. Some of those resources on my resource list at the end of the presentation would also be helpful. The U.S. Department of Education bears out these facts. And so if someone doesn't agree or they're challenging the fact that these things really do exist, you have the tools to say, well, would you consider watching this? And, we talk about Michelle Alexander, we talk about the new Jim Crow, but there are so many tools that can be used. And it doesn't have to be an argumentative way. I say all the time that in order for us to dismantle racist systems, it's going to take all of us. It's not a Black problem. It's not a brown problem. And I, as a Black person, cannot say, white people, you go fix it on your own because you created this problem. It's going to take all of us together. And so we have to engage in the dialogue. And I would say, don't grow weary of having the conversations, because conversations do change people's hearts. And this is an issue that we've got to wrap not just our minds around, but our hearts around, and really start to engage in those conversations so that we can bring people over and say, yes, you once thought this, but now you understand there's been some enlightenment, and you now understand that this is work that needs to be undertaken. I don't know if I answered your question. I'm trying to not speak for a long time. I'm trying to be cognizant of the time, but I'm also trying to answer your question. But these are very pithy questions.
Very good. I mean, to me, I think very, very good. And we all know that this discussion is something that's going to be ongoing. So hopefully this will kind of catapult some folks to talk about this in the classroom, which leads to our final question is how, and this is kind of a two-part question, but the first part is how do we, how can we specifically implement this in our classrooms is what one teacher asked. And then the second part is how do we take it more broadly, but how do we focus on this, or how do we specifically implement this in our classroom?
So again, restorative practices is very proactive, which is why I embrace restorative practices. So this can be done every single day in the classroom, starting off a class with checking in with your students, checking in, not as a teacher who is asking about whether they did their homework, but checking in as a concerned human relating to another human. That's the start of restorative practices, because that child will be very comfortable with you and may say, I don't know if there's any way we can get into a breakout room ourselves, but I have something to tell you that I don't feel comfortable with other people hearing about. But it really starts with those relationships. So understanding again that restorative practices is about empowering the students. It's about building and strengthening relationships. And so how we interact with each other is one big thing. Also, empowering students to make decisions about what should happen in the classroom as a consequence for something that another student has done. That is powerful. Have your own classroom judicial board. Let the students tell you what should be done. Let the students create their own rules for how folks should actually behave in the classroom. These things are very powerful because you are empowering them to create safe spaces for themselves. Also, starting off every day with the expectations that you create with the students. One day, say, I want to talk to you all about our safe space expectations. What are the rules for our safe space? What are the things that we want to be done in this classroom? How should we behave? How should we go about communicating with one another? What are the things that we don't want to see in our classrooms? And start off each day going through the expectations that you all created as a classroom community. And that will empower students. And it will also encourage everyone to really operate inside of the norms that they help to create. Because restorative practices really is about respect, integrity, accountability, and giving insight into the behaviors that other people engage in or that we engage in ourselves. And so those are some of the things just off the top of my head that I believe would be great. And so even if the semester has already started, it's never too late to say, I may be the teacher, but this is our classroom community, and to empower our students. So that's that part of the question. Jason, what was the other part?
I think that answers it. And for the sake of time, I just want to sum up kind of what you just said, and hopefully it will help to answer the broader question or just speak to it is one of the things that has been a key proponent of what you said that I think is the linchpin to all of this is the willingness on both sides for people to be committed to this particular process. And so I just want to thank the participants, teachers and students that ask questions and were so engaged. Thank you so much for doing that. And it shows a willingness that there is at least someone that's willing to do this. And there were some other questions about resources. Had you read before White Fragility and the one by Abraham Kendi? And so it just shows that there are folks who are out here that have been paying attention to this topic. And so on behalf of myself and Sonia, the entire team, San Diego County Office of Education, all the students and teachers that are going to have the privilege to watch this incredibly informative presentation, with all seriousness, from the bottom of my heart, as small as it may be, I just want to say, Genevieve, Miss Jones-Wright, my DA, one of the most incredible sisters that I've ever met in my life. Thank you so much for being so willing to come and share your heart. It's obvious that this is something that you are very passionate about, that you are thoroughly invested in. You've taken a lot of time to research to make it make sense. And I just want to say thank you for all. People don't even realize the ways that you have that you are implementing this into your own life and into your own nonprofit. And so I just want to say thank you for taking this time. It was really, really good. What you presented was incredible. And in closing, for yourself, could you just please tell folks if they want to get a hold of you, how would they do that? And maybe, yeah, and then we'll come back with a closing statement.
Absolutely. So I co-founded, along with another Black woman lawyer, MOGO, or Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance. We are an impact litigation organization, a nonprofit right here in San Diego. So we are doing the work to achieve racial and social justice. And we work on behalf of community members to hold government accountable to all people, especially those who are marginalized or disenfranchised. You can see what we're up to at www.moralgovernance.org. And I'll put that into the chat. You are welcome to see what we do, support us, monthly donations, $5 a month. It goes a very long way, but truly we can't engage in the work without everyone. And I really do mean that this is all of our work. In order for us to build an inclusive and a just and an equitable society, we've got to work together. So it's not about pointing fingers and laying blame. This is all of our world, and we all have a responsibility to do better in our world and for our world, and we have to do it together. So thank you all so much for being here.
Super amazing. Thank you again. And I just wanted to say again, thank you to everyone that took time to join. This is session 3 of a 4-part series, social injustice series. This is part 3. Tomorrow on October 15th at 2 p.m. we'll have Movement B, transformative social emotional learning workshop. Looking forward to that. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today. Sonia, I'll give you the last word, but I just want to say to you, thank you for putting this all together. Thank you for all the hard work that you always do to make sure that these innovative topics and ways to do it are available to the students all over the place. So thank you so much for you and your team and everybody. Love you a lot. Super happy that I know you. Okay, I'm going to mute myself.
Yeah, just one more minute. Thanks so much, Jason, for moderating today. So just to clarify, the session, day 4 of this series is actually at tomorrow at 1 p.m. So go ahead and log in to Sked, and you will find that link tomorrow. What you see on the screen right now should be a certificate of this presentation. Go ahead and take a picture, a screenshot, or a selfie, and send it to your district or your teacher who might be requiring it. Thanks so much to the speakers today. Here's Jason. To my friend Jason, Shanley, Genevieve, you're amazing. And I know Wes had to step off, he had to step away. So thanks so much to Wes as well. And Ms. Shan, thanks so much for helping me co-host today. We really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And, you can stop the recording.